Okay, so you know how sometimes it feels like to really get somewhere worthwhile, you got to be just grinding away, really just like pushing and pushing and pushing.
Absolutely.
And like, there's this feeling like if it's not a struggle, then like, did it even really count? Did you even really accomplish anything?
Right. It's almost like it's built into us,
Yeah.
Like we have to kind of suffer our way to success.
Yeah.
Like it's got to be blood, sweat, and tears to really be meaningful.
Yeah. No pain, no gain and all of that.
Totally.
So we got some really interesting stuff sent in this time from Effortless Make It Easier to Do by Greg McHugh.
Oh.
And it's all about how that assumption that to do something important, it has to be hard, might actually be what's tripping us up.
Yeah.
Like, what if there's a different way? What if there's a more effortless way to get to those same goals?
Right. And that's exactly what we're going to dive into today.
Yeah. So we're going to try to unpack, what are some of those assumptions that we make? What are some of the ways that we can kind of reframe our thinking and maybe find a different path?
Yeah. I love that. A different path.
Yeah.
To getting to those goals.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of us are kind of conditioned or even programmed culturally.
Yeah.
That, if it doesn't feel like a struggle, it's probably not that worthwhile.
Right.
It's probably not going to move the needle for us.
Yeah. It's like we're stuck with this choice between, easy but kind of pointless, or essential but a total slog. And there's no in between.
Yeah. Or even worse, that like that easy thing might actually be, frivolous or even like a little bit, silly or something. Like
Right.
a waste of time.
Right.
But this book is really challenging that idea.
Yeah.
And the way that it does this is it kind of takes us through a lot of stories and anecdotes. But one of the most compelling ones right out of the gate is the story of this guy named McGinnis, who's kind of at this breaking point where he realizes that, he's working so hard, he's pushing himself to the absolute limit, but it's actually starting to backfire. Like he's getting worse results the harder he tries.
Oh, wow. So it's like that point of diminishing returns where you're actually like going past the peak and you're starting to slide down the other side and you're not even realizing it.
Yeah. And what's so powerful about his story is that he's very analytical about this. He actually lays out his options. He says, okay, look, I can keep pushing myself to the limit, which isn't really sustainable, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or I could lower my goals and just accept that I'm not going to achieve what I really want to achieve, which didn't feel good to him.
Right.
Or he said there's this third path,
Oh, okay.
which is to find an easier way to get to what I'm after. And so he really consciously chose that third path. And what's so interesting is he actually ends up getting better investment returns. He ends up having more rewarding work, and he does it all in significantly fewer hours
Oh.
than he was working before.
So it's like that old saying, work smarter, not harder,
Totally.
but like actually putting it into practice.
Totally. And the real takeaway there that I think is so powerful is that idea that when you're pushing so hard that you can't push any harder,
Right.
that's not the time to just try and find some hidden reserve of energy to push even harder.
Right.
It's actually a sign that you need to completely rethink your approach. It's a sign that you need to look for a smarter way, a more strategic way, not just more brute force.
It's like shifting from a very kind of like, forceful way of approaching things to a more like a jujitsu kind of thing, where you're actually using the energy of the problem against itself almost.
Totally. Using leverage instead of just, sheer willpower.
Right.
So that really spoke to me because, I think a lot of us, including myself, we get in that mode where we're like, okay, got to push harder, got to do more, got to, grind it out.
Oh, yeah.
And what this is really saying is stop.
Right.
Pause, take a breath, and look for a different approach.
Yeah. So I think that leads us into this next point, which is the very real danger of overexertion and burnout.
Yuck.
Right? Which I think a lot of very ambitious people are very familiar with.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I think anyone who's really driven and wants to make a dent in the universe,
Yeah. Right.
they're probably pretty familiar with that feeling.
Yeah, that feeling of you're so engaged, you're so into what you're doing, you're putting your all into it, but at the same time, you're like one step away from just completely collapsing.
Right. Running on fumes.
Yeah, running on fumes. That's a great way to put it.
Yeah. And this book makes a really important point, which is that feeling isn't a badge of honor.
Right.
It's a warning sign.
Right.
It's not something to be, proud of.
Yeah.
It's actually a sign that something is wrong
Right.
with the way that you're approaching things.
Yeah, and I think we have this, cultural idea that burnout is somehow like proof that you're working hard enough,
Yeah.
that you're dedicated, that you're really serious. about what you're doing.
Yeah, like it's a necessary evil
Right.
on the path to success.
Right.
But the book really challenges that.
Yeah.
And what it says is that it's actually a cycle of depletion
Mm.
where you put more and more energy in, but the returns diminish over time.
Right.
So you end up, frustrated.
Yeah.
You end up exhausted.
Yeah.
And you end up doing less effective work.
Yeah. You're basically spinning your wheels at a certain point.
Totally.
You're just like getting nowhere.
So that raises a really important question for you.
Okay.
Which is, instead of accepting that struggle as the default,
Right.
what if you actually sought an easier path from the beginning?
So you're saying, like, rather than just assuming that it's going to be hard and we're going to have to push through it and we're going to get burned out along the way,
Yeah.
what if we just approach it with the assumption that, like, maybe there's a better way?
Yeah. What if it could be easier?
Okay, I like that. So it really makes you kind of rethink that knee-jerk reaction that we have when things start to get tough, doesn't it? Because often our first instinct is just to try and power through.
Yeah. Just push harder.
Push harder, grind it out.
Cancel through it.
Yeah, muscle through it. And maybe cut out a few things that feel unnecessary.
Right. Or even just say no to more things.
Yeah.
Just like pare back, pare back, pare back.
Yeah, and that actually leads us to this really interesting concept that the book talks about, which is the too many big rocks analogy.
Okay.
Because it's kind of saying, even when you've become really good at saying no, even when you're already, down to the bare essentials,
Yeah.
you can still feel completely overwhelmed.
Yeah, like you've stripped it down to just the most important things,
Right.
the non-negotiables.
Yeah.
And you're still like, how am I going to do all this?
I'm still drowning here.
Yeah.
What's going on?
And the author shares his own experience of this.
Yeah.
He's got this like really successful career. He's got a family. He's got all these things going on.
Right.
And he's like, I've already cut everything down to the bone,
Right.
but I still feel completely overloaded.
Yeah.
And that's where that big rocks theory comes in,
Okay.
which a lot of people have probably heard of, where it's about prioritizing the most fundamental things
Okay.
in your life. So it's like your health, your family, your most important relationships,
Got it.
and making sure that those things get taken care of first.
Right. So it's that classic analogy of, like, you've got a jar
Yeah.
and you've got to fit in the big rocks first.
Mhm.
And then theoretically, all the other little stuff like the sand and the pebbles, it'll fit in around the edges.
Exactly.
Okay.
But the really crucial question that the book poses, and it's one that I really want you to think about, is what happens when you have too many big rocks? What happens when you have too many things that are absolutely essential,
Right.
that simply won't fit within the finite resources
Right.
of your time and energy?
Yeah. That's the real dilemma.
Yeah.
Because it's not like you can just say no to your health or you can't just say no to your family.
Right. These are things that you have to take care of.
You have to figure out how to make it work
Right.
somehow.
And the book actually makes this point even more powerful by anchoring it in a really personal and really real experience,
Okay.
which is the author's daughter has a seizure.
Oh, wow.
And in that moment, all of the things, all the other important things in his life didn't just magically go away.
Right.
He still had work responsibilities. He still had all these other things. But now he has this, very urgent medical situation
Right.
that he has to deal with. So it's like this perfect example of what happens when the big rocks multiply.
Yeah.
And you just don't have the capacity to do it all.
Wow. Yeah, that puts it in a whole different perspective,
Yeah.
for sure. So what was his takeaway from that experience?
Well, the thing that really struck him was that he wasn't focused on the wrong things.
Okay.
He was tackling the right priorities. He was doing the right things for the right reasons. But the way that he was approaching them was unsustainable. It was leading to burnout.
Yeah.
It was leading to frustration. It was making him less effective.
Right.
So it wasn't about what he was doing.
Yeah.
It was about how he was doing it.
Okay, so this is really getting to the heart of the matter here, which is it's not necessarily about, cutting things out or saying no to things.
Yeah.
It's about fundamentally changing the way that you approach the things that you're already doing.
Exactly.
Okay.
And that really sets the stage for the core of the book's solution,
Okay.
which is this concept of effortless action
Okay.
and understanding this really critical difference between linear and residual results.
Okay, so let's dig into that.
Yeah.
Because I think that's where we start to move beyond just identifying the problems.
Right.
And start to actually explore, like, what are some of the tangible strategies that we can use
Right.
to actually find that easier path.
Yeah.
So what are linear results?
So linear results are basically what we're all used to.
Okay.
It's that one-to-one kind of outcome.
Okay.
You put in the effort, you get a direct result.
Got it.
And when you start putting in the effort, the result stops too. So think of it like getting paid hourly.
Okay.
You work for an hour,
Yeah.
you get paid for an hour.
Right.
You stop working, you stop getting paid.
Makes sense.
It's a direct benefit tied directly to the exertion of effort,
Okay.
right? But residual results operate on a totally different principle.
Okay.
Here, you invest the effort up front,
Okay.
and then the benefits continue to flow over time, often compounding.
Okay.
So think of something like investing money wisely.
Got it.
You do the research up front, you make the decision,
Right.
you invest the money,
Yeah.
and then ideally you're getting returns for years to come.
Right, without having to constantly be putting in more work.
Exactly.
So that's really interesting because with linear results, it's like you're constantly having to be, pedaling the bike to keep it moving.
Right.
But with residual results, it's almost like you're, pushing a boulder down a hill.
Yeah.
And once it gets going, it's going to keep rolling.
Exactly.
Whether you're there or not.
And so the real power here is that when you apply effortless action, meaning you're finding those smarter, more streamlined ways of working
Right.
to those activities that generate residual results, you can create this incredible snowball effect. You're setting things in motion that continue to pay off long after your initial effort.
Yeah, I really like that analogy of the snowball effect. Because it's like, you start with a small snowball, but as you roll it downhill, it just keeps getting bigger and bigger,
Yes.
and the momentum builds.
And it requires less effort from you
Right.
to keep it going.
Yeah.
And so the book argues that, achieving something once through sheer willpower is great,
Yeah.
but being able to achieve that same outcome with ease
Right.
and then being able to repeat that effortlessly,
Right.
that's the real game changer.
Yeah, I mean, you can only brute force your way through so many things before you just completely burn out.
Totally.
Right.
And so it's about building systems and approaches that work for you,
Yeah.
not against you.
Okay, so this is all great, but how do we actually do this? How do we actually find those easier paths?
Right.
How do we shift from that linear thinking to that residual thinking?
Yeah. And that's where the book goes into some really interesting strategies. And one of them that really grabbed my attention is this idea of weakening the impossible
Okay.
by strategically finding indirect paths.
What does that mean?
So sometimes we come up against challenges that just feel impossible.
Yeah.
Right.
Nope. Yeah, I think all of us have been there.
Right. And our instinct is often to try and attack the problem head on. We have
Right.
to just put all of our force and energy directly at the obstacle.
Right.
But the book argues that sometimes the most direct path is actually the least effective because it creates the most resistance.
Okay.
So they use this amazing historical example to illustrate this point, which is the story of William Wilberforce
Okay.
and the decades-long fight to abolish the slave trade.
Wow. Yeah, that was a huge undertaking.
Huge undertaking,
Yeah.
decades of work. And, he faced incredible political opposition.
Right.
People who were very deeply entrenched
Right.
in this system.
With a lot to lose
Totally.
from this thing changed.
And so for years, he was going at it very directly, making the moral argument,
Yeah.
trying to, push legislation through.
Right.
And he was constantly hitting these roadblocks.
So what changed?
So what changed is that this other guy, James Stephen, came along, and he had this very strategic insight,
Okay.
which is that instead of trying to attack the problem head on,
Yeah.
he looked for an indirect vulnerability. So instead of making another argument about the moral reprehensibility of slavery,
Right.
he focused on this seemingly unrelated issue, which was the misuse of neutral flags by slave ships during wartime.
Okay.
So at the time, England was at war with France, and slave ships were flying neutral flags
Okay.
to evade British patrols.
Got it.
And so Stephen wrote this pamphlet called War in Disguise, where he meticulously detailed this abuse of maritime law. And he built this whole case around this neutral, almost technical issue.
Okay.
And what's fascinating is that by focusing on this seemingly side issue,
Right.
he was able to build a lot of support
Okay.
because it wasn't directly challenging the pro-slavery interests.
Got it. So it was almost like a stealth attack.
Yeah, it was a total flanking maneuver,
Yeah.
right? And so they were able to get these laws passed that crippled the British slave trade
Wow.
without actually explicitly going after slavery in the initial push.
That's incredible. So it's almost like, they snuck it in the back door
Totally.
while everyone was distracted by something else.
Yeah.
Wow. So that's really interesting because It's saying that sometimes the goal is so big and so audacious
Yeah.
that you can't just go directly at it.
Right.
You have to kind of find those pressure points, those levers of influence.
The side door.
Yeah, the side door
Yeah.
that are going to kind of like chip away at it indirectly
Yeah.
until eventually you can achieve what you're after.
Yeah. And it's really making me think, like, where in my life are there things where I'm like butting up against this wall
Yeah.
and I'm trying to force it
Yeah.
and I'm not getting anywhere,
Yeah.
when maybe there's a different approach.
What's the side door?
Yeah, what's the side door?
Yeah.
So that's really fascinating. And it's not just, these big historical examples.
Right.
The book actually brings this down to a very practical level
Yeah.
with a story about Southwest Airlines
Okay.
and their ticketing system.
Okay.
So back in the day, they were struggling with the fact that traditional paper tickets
Yeah.
were super expensive to produce.
Right.
They were slow.
Right.
They were inefficient.
Not a good system.
Yeah, not a good system.
Yeah.
And so they could have just thrown more technology at the problem.
Right.
They could have tried to develop, more sophisticated printing methods or whatever.
Yeah, just like optimize the existing system, make
Right.
it a little better.
Make it a little bit better.
Yeah.
But instead, they took a step back.
Okay.
And they questioned this fundamental assumption, which is, did they even need those elaborate multi-part printed tickets in the first place?
Interesting.
Right?
Yeah.
So just by questioning that assumption,
Sure.
they were able to come up with this much simpler and far more cost-effective solution,
Okay.
which was to have these simple printable tickets from automatic dispensers.
Oh, wow.
So you go up to the machine, you punch in your information, and it prints you out a ticket.
Wow.
It's simple.
Simple and cheap.
Yeah. So it's amazing how just by being willing to question that underlying assumption,
Right.
they were able to completely rethink the problem
Yeah.
and come up with this much easier solution.
Totally.
So it's a great reminder for all of us to be constantly asking ourselves, like, what are the assumptions that I'm making
Yeah.
that might be limiting me?
Yeah. What's the box?
Yeah. What's the box that I'm stuck
That
in?
I'm not even seeing.
Yeah, I'm not even seeing. And
Yeah.
how can I think outside of that box
Yeah.
to come up with something new? Because often the difficulty that we perceive in a problem
Right.
isn't inherent to the problem itself.
Yeah.
It's a byproduct of the way that we've defined it
Right.
and the assumptions that we're bringing to it.
Right. So if we can shift our thinking,
Yeah,
then suddenly those impossible problems might become much more manageable.
totally.
Yeah. So this leads us to another really important piece of this effortless puzzle,
Okay.
which is the idea that, important work doesn't have to be a grind.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be this like joyless slog.
Ugh, I love this part.
Yeah.
Because it's so true.
I mean, who hasn't felt that way?
Right?
Right? Where it's like, oh, I got to do this thing. I
Yeah.
don't want to do it, but I know it's important.
Yeah.
So I'm just going to like white knuckle my way through it.
Yeah. And clench my jaw and just like push through.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But this book is saying like, what if it didn't have to be that way?
What if it could be fun?
Yeah.
What if it could be enjoyable?
What if we could actually look forward to doing the things that we know we need to do?
Totally.
So how do we do that?
So one of the strategies that the book talks about is this idea of pairing essential activities with sources of enjoyment.
Okay.
So it's like instead of just resigning yourself to slogging through those tasks that are necessary, but maybe not inherently thrilling,
Right.
you proactively look for ways to make them more engaging.
Okay, so it's like hacking the system
Yeah,
a little bit.
totally. It's like hacking your own brain.
Right,
Right.
right. Okay, I like that.
And they use this really great example, which is the story of Ron Culberson and the Pinewood Derby.
Okay.
So if you're not familiar with the Pinewood Derby, it's this thing that a lot of kids do where they build these little wooden cars
Oh, yeah.
and then they race them.
Yeah, my kids did that. It was
Yeah.
a big deal.
It's a big deal.
Yeah.
And so Ron Culberson, he's talking about how he dreaded this
Okay.
because he was not good at building fast cars.
Yeah.
He didn't enjoy the process. And it was just this source of frustration for both him and his son.
Yeah.
But then they shifted their focus.
Okay.
And instead of trying to win the race,
Yeah.
they decided to go for the design award. And suddenly the whole experience became enjoyable
Oh, wow.
because it tapped into his creativity,
Okay.
his sense of humor.
Yeah.
And so they built this car that looked like a giant hot dog,
Okay.
and they had a blast doing it.
Oh, that's awesome.
Right. And so the point of the story is that the enjoyment itself became a reward. even though they didn't win the race.
So it's almost like they shifted the goalposts
Totally.
a little bit.
Totally.
And by doing that, they actually found a way to make it fun.
Yeah.
Yeah, I really like that.
And so the book encourages you to think about, like, what are those little things that bring you joy?
Yeah.
And how can you weave those into your essential routines?
Yeah. So it's not just about, trying to find ways to make the task itself more fun.
Yeah.
It's about actually intentionally incorporating things that you enjoy. Exactly.
Into the process.
Yeah, like building those little rewards
Right.
into the process.
Right.
So you're not just delaying gratification.
Right.
Until the very end, you're actually finding ways to enjoy it along the way.
Yeah, I love that.
Yeah.
And they give a really simple example of that, which is adding dark chocolate almonds to a weekly financial review meeting.
Yes.
Right?
That's so good.
Like, it's such a simple thing.
Such a small thing.
But it makes such a difference.
Totally. It makes it a little bit more fun.
Yeah.
And they even encourage you to create your own personal list
Oh,
of these little building blocks of joy.
I love that.
Right? So that you can intentionally incorporate those into your routines.
Yeah, because if you have it written down,
Yeah.
then you're more likely to actually do it.
Totally.
Right.
And the more you do it,
Yeah.
the more it becomes a habit.
Right.
And then the easier it is to actually find that enjoyment in the process.
So as we're kind of wrapping up this deep dive.
Yeah. What are some of the key takeaways that you're walking away with from Effortless?
Well, I think the biggest one is that we have a choice.
Okay.
We don't have to just accept that life has to be this constant uphill battle.
Right.
That we have to just grind and push and suffer our way to success.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point because so often we just assume that that's the way it is.
Totally.
Right.
You don't even question it.
We don't even question it.
Yeah.
We just think like, oh, well, that's just how life is.
That's how you get ahead.
Yeah, you got to pay your dues.
Yeah.
Right.
But this book is saying, like, no, you don't.
You have other options.
There are other ways.
Okay.
And it's about being intentional.
Yeah.
About finding those easier paths.
Yeah.
It's about being strategic about the way that you approach your goals.
Right. So instead of just focusing on what you're doing, it's about focusing on how you're doing it.
Exactly.
And looking for ways to make it more effortless.
Totally. Yeah. And the really cool thing is that when you start to do that, you actually free up more energy.
Right.
To do the things that really matter.
To do the things that you actually enjoy.
Totally.
Yeah.
So it's a win-win.
So to kind of bring this all together and give our listeners something to really chew on, as they're going about their day.
Yeah.
Think about one area in your life.
Okay.
Whether it's at work or in your personal life or in your relationships or wherever.
Yeah.
That feels really challenging right now. Where it's like you're just butting up against this wall and it feels really hard.
Yeah.
And instead of just thinking like, okay, I got to push harder.
Yeah.
I got to grind it out. What if you pause for a minute and you ask yourself, what if this could be easy? What if there's a different way?
What if there's a side door?
What if there's a side door?
Yeah.
What if there's a way to make this more enjoyable?
Right.
Just see what comes up.
Yeah. And maybe you'll surprise yourself.
Yeah. Maybe you will.
Yeah.
All right. So on that note,
Yeah.
we're going to wrap things up.
Sounds good.
But keep those questions in mind.
Absolutely.
And we'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.
See you around.